Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu v'asok b'divrei
Torah.
Torah. So, I was thinking about the subject that we are dealing with, right? These here we're talking about a personal level of tumah. We finished up with leprosy, and we're talking about a level of tumah that is impurity, spiritual impurity that is called zav, right? Or this has to do with a level of something called a zav. The word zav means, and in reflecting on this topic in general, because it has to do with our bodies, it has to do with a male body, it has to do with a female body. The symptoms are different. They essentially, yesterday we learned that essentially we're talking about a flow from the body that comes from the genital area. So, of course, the male genital area, the female genital area are different. And the kind of flow that happens, we discussed the sort of flow that comes from a male body. We hadn't really gotten into the idea of what flows, the blood that flows from a female body, etc. But we'd gotten into this. And I was taking it as I was reflecting on this, and this I want to say at the very get-go, and I've mentioned it, of course, as we've gone through these. This whole topic is of both ritual impurity, etc. Very arcane, difficult topic. I'm
Hello.
doing the best I can myself.
Hi,
As
Erling. How you doing?
sorry, okay, Lanny,
I'm
you're going to
fine.
have to mute. Lanny, you need to mute. At any rate, in reflecting on this, um, the nature of our bodies, and I think one of the greatest errors of our current society has to do with the assumption we make that our bodies belong to us. And that assumption, if you think your body belongs to you, then if it belongs to you, you can do whatever you like to it. You can treat it any other way. You own it. Because, of course, the nature of ownership is the degree of control you exercise over that particular item. And I would say that the Torah wants us to understand in a very fundamental kind of way that we don't own our bodies. We've touched on this before, but what we are, in a sense, are renters because we didn't have our bodies from the very beginning. We were brought into this world through the agency of others. And of course, we all are very aware, or should be, that at some point we are going to have to leave our bodies. We're not going to have them anymore. And so, how do you deal with that particular situation? And part of that understanding is we don't own our bodies, which means, again, that we have to treat our bodies as if we are just simply occupying space and that we're renting them. We have the privilege of occupying them in the course of our lifetime. And essentially, our relationship to our bodies is that just as you have to take care of a property that you are renting, we have to take care of our bodies. We have to take care. And not only that, if we don't own our bodies, then we are directly subject to the rules of the one who owns our bodies. And our bodies aren't ownerless, our bodies are owned by the one who created us. And so, this awareness to be mindful, conscious of this means that there are rules that involve our bodies that we need to be aware of and to do our best to observe them. Now, this whole area, of course, of Tuma and Tara is one that is not sort of one that we deal with constantly these days. And there are practical reasons. But on the other hand, to be aware of these laws, to make ourselves aware of the fact that these are here, and to perhaps understand why they might be important. They may not be important to us. They may not have been important to us. We may be looking at them a little bit more in a different light than we did. But clearly they were important to our tradition, very important. And so the question then arises, well, why? Why would they be so important? And I, at this point, in terms of my own understanding, I am pretty convinced that there are ways in which for us to understand that, in fact, because we don't own our bodies and we are not identical to our bodies, we are more than our bodies. Our bodies are simply, in a way, clothing to who we really are, to our inner selves. And that that the Torah is trying to give us ways in this consciousness raising, what we're doing project is to allow us to realize that we may well be immortal, and that if we are careful about how we live our lives, etc., we actually may be able to exist without necessarily being attached to the clothing of our bodies. And that really is one of the reasons. I don't think it's the only reason, but it is one of the reasons why this is so important. Because again, if I'm correct in saying that the essential subject of religion, any religion, is the issue of significance. Well, if we're here, we come into the world, and after a space of time, very finite, short, compared to eternity, space of time, we no longer exist, then it's very hard to find significance. Very hard. I'm not saying there aren't ways, but whether or not they really are significant aspects of significance, I'm not sure. Yes, I do believe that one little thing, one little mantra we should have is that the reason we're here is to try to make in our own relatively limited ways, some more limited than others, most of us extremely limited, this world a slightly better place than it was when we came in. And that has to do with our relationships and how we treat our property and treat the world and the environment, etc., that it be a little bit better and not worse for our having, uh, taken our path in the course of this world. So that's sort of background to what we're doing. And now we're going to get into the nitty gritty of what's going on. And again, when I say nitty gritty, it's nitty gritty, but compared to how deeply we could get into and how deeply our tradition actually does go into this in the course of the commentary and the Talmud and all the other various sources that speak to this subject, we are scratching the surface. So, verse 3, Vezot tihye tumato bezovo. And this will be, tihye, tumato, the nature of his impurity when he is flowing, in his flux. Rar besaro. So again, his flesh will drip it zovo with his discharge, with his flow. Or it could be, in other words, what it's saying is that this flow is uncontrollable. He can't stop. It's constantly flowing, right? Or echtim besaro, or in fact, he cannot. In other words, nothing is coming out. It's stopped up. Right? Let's just finish up the verse. Mizovo, from its flow, tumato, regardless, it is the nature of his impurity. Let's take a look at the Rashi. You can see as a little bit to say, and I'll do the best I can here. Rar, this word rar, lashon rir. This is associated with a word that means spittle, spit. Shezav et besaro. So it's as if his flesh, that is his genital area, is spitting. Et sovo, his flow. Gemor rir sheyotze salo. So in this case, we are talking about spittle, which comes out clear. Spittle, regular spittle, is clear. Or hechtim, or it's sealed up. But here, look at this, how he interprets it. So it doesn't sound here that it actually is completely stopped, but we're going to have to look further here because he says, sheyotze av. In other words, that it's not coming out as this clear, thin liquid, but it's coming out thick, thick. It is so thick, shes besotem et pi ha'ama, And so that it is blocking, sotem, blocking the entrance to the penis here. Ama means the membrum, the member of the body, the organ. It's just a nice way, a euphemistic way of referring to male genitalia. Vinistam basaro, here we go. And his flesh, again, this is the Torah's way of referring to that part of the man's body. Metipa, right? So it from the dripping or the drop of zovo. So something, this is the way, the nature of the blockage, right? Zehu pshuto. And Rashi is saying this is the basic, simple, straightforward understanding of this particular text. Umidrasho, however, there is a midrashic way of looking at this, which is found in Megillah, in the tractate Megillah 8, page 8, I guess, Nida Mem Gimel, or in the tractate Nida, which is on page 43. So, Mana Hakatuv Arishon, right? So, when in examining these verses, Scripture counts the first text counts Ra'ayot Shtaim. It talks about two appearances, the Karo Tameh. And in those two appearances, he is impure. He is considered impure. Shenemar, and how do we know this? It says Zav Nibzaro, right? So it flows from his flesh. Zovo Tameh. So it's got this two words of the word Zav, right? His flow is impure. Okay. Tameh hu. Umana hakatuv hasheni. And this second scriptural verse says Ra'ayot Shalosh, or Re'iyot Shalosh. It talks about three appearances, the Kar'ot Tameh, and they're also referred to as Tameh, as impure. Shene'emar, as it says, Tumato bezobo. Here we go, right? His impurity is in his flow. Rar besaro, his flesh is raring, right? Et zovo is flow. Or hichtim besaro, and that's the third one, right? That his flesh was blocked. Nizovo, from his from his flow to mato it is his impurity. Let's just take a look, please, if we may. Okay, so this is actually the second one here that's referred to as the second verse. If we go back to the previous verse here, look at this, right? Ish ki ezav mitzaro zavotamehu. So they're the two types. They're the two sightings. It's using duplicate language. Ish, every man. So ki ezav mitzaro zavotamehu. So there's the zav and there's the zav. And in this verse, and I look at the second verse here, the one that follows, right? Okay, here we go, right? Here we go, right? Tumato bezovo, there's that first. Rar besaro et zovo, right? Or hechtim besaro. So they're the three. So this is at least how I, in working over this and going over this and trying to get my head wrapped around what's going on here. That's my understanding of it at this point. Again, I've used this term before. It's a work in progress. Okay. So let's see, go ahead. Okay. Okay. Okay, so how Ketzad? So how is this? In other words, how do we get this conclusion that Rashi has given us? How? Shtayim, two, right? Letum'ah, right? So the first two sightings, in other words, why three, why two, and then three? So the first two are just to indicate that he is in a state of impurity and he's going to have to deal with that impurity. We've talked about the fact that there are ways of, let's just use a term, being cured of your impurity. The word cure is perhaps a little too literal, but at least to be able to become purified, to be purified from your impurity. V'hashlishit, and the third time, maskikato lekorban. The fact that there's a third level means that he actually in the process of purification, he has to bring a sacrifice. Sacrifice. So we are going to continue and keep learning a little bit about what's involved here. So this is how serious we are talking about the level of impurity. And we have talked about the fact that there are levels of impurity, the most serious going through to the lightest. There are several levels, and the way in which you determine the seriousness of it, in other words, the practical outcome of what this impurity involves, has to do with what it affects and how it affects it. In other words, the most impure thing, it doesn't take much to be affected by that impurity and to contract it. Whereas the lighter levels of impurity, it doesn't affect to the same level. And also the process of becoming cleansed is also, of course, affected by the level of impurity. So here we go. So this particular level of Zav, which we said is Chamor, it is a first degree. There is something that is the originator of the first degree. So there's something that is more than this, and this is the first degree impurity, it's called. Kol hamishkav. So here we go. Anything asher yishkav alav hazav. So any item on which he lays on it, that is hazav, this one who's experiencing this flow, yitma, will become impure. So lying down on it, just simply the fact that your body has been on this particular item, right? But it says mishkav, and that's important. It becomes impure. So very often the simplest way in which impurity is contracted is through touch. But here it's not, as you will see, right? You're lying down on it. The whole hakli asher yeshev alav, and any vessel upon which he sits, yitma, it will become impure. Impure. Let's take a look at the Rashi. This is important here. So, kol hamishkav, anything on which he lays down. In other words, the reason why the Torah is designating a mishkav is hara'ui le mishkav. In other words, this particular vessel on which he is putting his weight, okay, or his presence, has to be designed as something on which is you lay on. In other words, it's got to be designed as a couch. Yachol afilu miyuchad lemelacha acheret. Wait a second, he says, well, let's not just assume that. Let's assume that maybe it was designed for something else. Okay? In other words, that you had this, I don't know, some object that's a fairly large object that you use for work, for something else, and wasn't designed as a couch, right? Simply as a couch, but was designed for some other kind of usage. Talmud Lomar, and for this reason, Scripture teaches us Asher Yishkav, right? So remember, it says Kol Hamishkav Asher Yishkav Alav. So these additional words say that it needs to be something designed on which a person lays down, right? So let's keep going. Let's see. The Asher Shachav, and it says upon which he lay down. Oh, sorry. It doesn't say upon which he lay down. It doesn't say Asher Shachav lo ne'amar. It says Asher Yishkav. That's a future tense, an imperfect tense. It means, in other words, uncompleted action on which he will lay down, we could translate it as. And Rashi is saying, it doesn't say upon which he laid upon. It doesn't say that, lo ne'amar, ela asher yishkav. In other words, on which he will lay down. The fact that it says he will lay down, we have to understand by that. Hameyuchad tamid l'chach. In other words, it's an object which has exactly been designated precisely for laying down, right? So you know that when your bed, for example, you know that it's designed for you to lay upon it. On the other hand, let's say I hope this is a good example, but let's say a seat on a tractor, okay? You're not going to lay down on it, right? Although we did see that we talked about something of yeshev, he will sit down. But again, I don't know if it would include it. It might include a tractor seat, but you'll see maybe it does. But on the other hand, I don't know, a step stool. A step stool, you can sit on a step stool, but you'll see. How do we know that that is not what we're talking about? That is not, in other words, the Torah is defining the kind of vessel which is capable of becoming tameh. Right? So here we go. Yatzah, so an exception, in other words, something that is not included in this law. Zeh she'omrim law, something where they would say to him, Amod, stand up, v'naseh melachtenu, so that we can do our work. So the step stool might be a good example. Let's say he's sitting on the step stool, and they're going to say, please get up so we can use the step stool to do our work, so that we can reach up and do it, right? Or maybe you can sit on the steps of a ladder. You follow me? So those kinds of things, if he sits on them, and maybe there's something larger that he might lay down on, they are things that if they're being used for other purposes, and they were never designed, even though you can use them for that purpose, but they weren't designed for it, they will not become tameh. That's the point that's being made. So here we go. Asher Yeshev. So likewise, it says Asher Yeshev, upon which he will sit. Right? Yashav lo ne'amar. It doesn't say on which he sat, right? But in other words, something that is designed to be sat on. Ella asher yeshev alav. So it doesn't say yashav. It says, but which he will sit. Hazav, upon the one who's experiencing the soul. B'meyuchad tamid l'chach. Okay, right. So, in other words, again, just like the bed, we're talking, or the couch, the thing on which you lay, the cot, right? Likewise, the stool has to be designed as precisely something on which people sit. So we are going to have to stop here, and we will, God willing, continue when we next meet. And I'm going to put in the little place here. And little by little, I hope we gain a better understanding of what's going on here, and we will be able to go to the next verse at this point. So, okay. Oops, sorry. Okay. I'll figure this out later, I guess. Here we go. Technicalities. I'm going to stop the share. And for the record, if any of you have any questions about what's going on here, David, you have to have a question of some kind.
I do.
Yes, good. Okay.
Defecation.
Yes, defecation.
Defecation. Yeah.
Yes,
You know, you're always your body. If your tummy because of a uh, discharge from the penis
correct.
that has happened, it might ought to be active at that point.
Yes,
Why you're if you're if you defecate, you're
yes.
still uh, it's dirt. It's feces. It's not clean. How does that work out?
It doesn't render you impure, okay? Because we do not see the anus as an area of procreation, okay? Again, the whole issue of genitalia is that it allows the miracle of conception and birth to take place. So feces, they are referred to only in terms of, and it's discussed, okay, because of its smell and because of its content, etc. That there are things that are holy that you should not do in the presence of feces. So you don't, if you're outside and there's dog do somewhere around, okay, you don't pray in that area. And it feels like it's more a matter of respect. There's also a really interesting little law in Deuteronomy that says that when you go out if you go out to camp, or you're in the army, whatever, and you're out in the field, you're to take a spade with you to cover up your feces. So it's a matter of respect, but we're not talking about something so deep as this Tuma and Tahara. And again, It's very significant that we're talking only about something that's flowing from the genital area. For a man, it's flowing because we know it's through seminal emission that conception can take place. So the question is, plain seminal emission, if it's not done for the sake of procreation, we'll talk about this. In these passages here in Leviticus, it'll talk about a regular seminal emission. Okay. Usually it's in the context of like a wet dream. Okay. That does have a level of impurity, but not the level of impurity of Zav, which is now a flow that is uncontrollable. There's no control to this. And also, he's already discussed yesterday when we discussed it, our previous lesson, we talked about how these two different flows look, how seminal emission looks like one kind of liquid, and how this Zav, this liquid that's coming out here, this flow, looks different. Okay. So as far as feces are concerned, yeah, I mean they need to be treated respectfully and with thought, but they do not have, because it's got nothing to do with procreation, they don't go into this particular area.
Okay, thanks.
David? No, thank you for the question, Morris. You for me, you clarified it too, in the fact that I came to the realization that what it is has to do with procreation. Yeah, go ahead, David.
I was just thinking of it, that the human body has all these holes in it, and these are all miracles. So the anus is, even though it discharges feces, it's still a miracle.
Well, we know we have a blessing that we say after we,
Right.
when we go to the toilet, we say a blessing, acknowledging the fact that we're created in such a way that we're able to do this. And it's part of what allows us to actually exist, because God help you if you cannot, pass water or defecate. God help you. You won't last very long. Tragically, I knew someone back in South Africa, a fellow who worked at the synagogue there, a really wonderful person. His name, by the way, incidentally, was Moses. Okay, beautiful guy, who later on, unfortunately, I guess his kidneys shut down or something, and he swelled up like you wouldn't believe. He was in the hospital, and he never made it. It was terrible, terrible. Yeah. It is a miracle. But procreation is even a greater miracle in a way, right? I mean, it really is. And just to, again, take a step back, how it tries to train us to reformulate the way in which we look at our reality and look at our world and look at our experience and be aware of how powerful, these forces are within us, and to be respectful and appreciative and those sorts of things. It's transformative in terms of how you feel as a human being. And of course, I have a theory that if we were to use religion in a proper way, because religion can be obviously abused and used as an excuse for some of the worst ills in the world. But if we understand what it really is about and how it's supposed to make us respectful and compassionate and generous and, not narcissistic, be a better place for all of us.
Yeah. Rabbi, not to be funny, but I have to go.
I know. Well, you might want to say that differently and simply say, I have to leave.
I have to leave.
There we go. We all do. Take care and look forward to seeing you again. Take care. Bye-bye.